what did ordinary Koreans think about the year 2015? Upfront went out to the street to hear people's opinions.
I think it's the rise of startups, as the government has put in a lot of effort for the creative economy drive.
I heard a lot about the youth unemployment issue.
The news that shocked me the most was the recent terror attacks that took place in Paris.
I think the MERS outbreak was the hottest issue of this year.
I think the MERS outbreak was the biggest issue as it spread widely within a short period of time.
The hottest issue of 2015, the MERS outbreak. The most searched word by the Korean public in 2015 was MERS, or Middle East Respiratory Syndrome, which hit the country in the first half of the year. MERS spread across the country after the first case was confirmed. The concerned public searched various key words on the internet, including its symptoms and preventive measures. But with hard work from medical workers and cooperation from the public, the virus was beaten. The second hot issue, trade agreements. Trade agreements made the most headlines in the field of economy in 2015. The TPP, or Trans-Pacific Partnership Trade Agreement, signaled the birth of one of the largest FTAs in the world. Korea is pondering its response after expressing will to join the trade deal. Korea-China FTA was another hot issue in the field of trade this year. 3 years after Korea and China started negotiations on the FTA, the two countries officially signed a free trade agreement in June of 2015. 5 months later, in November, Korea's National Assembly approved the trade deal, allowing it to come into force on December 20th. The third hot topic, multilateral diplomacy. During President Park's first overseas trip in 2015, a visit to 4 Middle Eastern countries, she was accompanied by the largest ever business delegation. The president then visited 4 countries in Central and South America in April. In September, she participated in the Chinese Victory Ceremony, reaffirmed the strong ties between the two countries. The president also participated in the G20 summit and APEC forum held in November to discuss various global issues. At the UN General Assembly, as well as the 2015 UN Climate Change Conference, or COP21, the president announced a range of initiatives for Korea to take leadership in the global community. 2015 was yet another busy year for Korea. We look forward to more good news for the country in the upcoming year.
Hello, I'm Seung-yeon. Year 2015 is coming to an end. For today's Upfront, we'd like to look back on the issues that made headlines both within Korea and in the world this year. For today's discussion, we're joined by some great experts in the studio. First, we're joined by John Linton, president of the Korea's Foundation for International Healthcare, and Park Tae-woo, political commentator as well as research professor at the Institute of Sustainable Development in Korea University, and Young-joon, managing partner of the Seoul office of the international law firm of Milbank, and also chairman of the Asian University for Women Support Foundation. And we're also joined by a very popular Korean writer who is also a cultural critic, Mr. Seung-yeon. Thank you for joining today.
Thank you. Thank you for having us.
Now, today's discussion will be divided into 2 sections. One, domestic issues and the global issues. So let's start with the domestic issues. And I think that the starting point would be a most searched keyword in Korea, which was MERS. And Dr. Linton, I think this is a question kind of suited for you. This outbreak of MERS has put Korea's disease management system on a spotlight. How do you think we did, looking back?
Initially, there were some very, I think we were overly optimistic, and there were quite a few mistakes made. But I always say about the MERS epidemic that, or this happening, it's not really an epidemic, that it has to do with the culture of Koreans in the hospital. In other words, if you take care of your mother or your father, you must be in the hospital with them. So to make a very long story short, in the emergency room and the multi-patient wards, we had a very high density of people, and that facilitated the spread of MERS. So in some ways, if you look at it, it's a very culturally nice thing that Koreans feel they have to take care of their parents, so they're on the spot. But it presented a huge problem in infectious disease, and obviously the virus spreaded very quickly because of this cultural necessity to take care of your mother and father or your relative. And that is the weak link. That is what caused the spread of MERS. And later on, now it requires to correct it, it requires a correction of culture.
Right.
And also requires a huge expenditure on more nursing, because many of the family members have done nursing jobs in the past. So it's not, I want to say from the outset, the MERS is not a simple problem to solve. It's very complex. And it was not really, it could have happened anywhere. It happened at certain hospitals and not at certain hospitals.
Right.
Our hospital was very lucky in that we didn't have an epidemic or you know, a mass.
As in Yonsei.
At Yonsei.
Right.
But that doesn't mean we did a better job.
Professor Park,
Yes.
Can we look at it as an extension of the safety issues that we've dealt with at the beginning of the Seoul, and there were kind of a spread issues, and that's partly the reason why we have the new ministry, the Ministry of Public Safety and Security. In light of that, do you think that there has been some improvements?
Well, hot debate was going on right after this MERS breakup that we have to change the structure of Ministry of Health and Welfare, probably separately creating another ministry to take care of this kind of infectious diseases. But originally, after several affair sinking, the Ministry of Public Safety and Security was originally to take care of these kind of things. But we witnessed that the very ministry was not capable of dealing with this kind of infectious diseases. So many opinions, debate were going on in the National Assembly, probably to create independent another ministries. But we came to a conclusion that let's create another vice ministry level within the health ministry to thoroughly take care of these kind of infectious diseases breakups in the future. We wonder still that bureaucracies in Korean government could take care of these kind of emergent happenings in the future, because not many experts within the health ministries to deal with these kind of very dangerous diseases in the future. Rather, a lot of bureaucrat, high-ranking officials, not expert on the diseases. This is the question, I think. So we are closely watching whether they could be capable of dealing with the kind of emergent situation in the future. But right now, quite doubtful, I think.
I see. If the question is, I think, the control tower, then we have not really seen the concrete evidence that there is already in place or it has effectiveness. I guess we'll have to
not yet proven, I think.
Next time around. I hope it gets better as we deal with those issues. Mr. Kim, let's focus on kind of a side effect that the MERS had on the economy. I think the Korean economy has been depressed because of this communicable disease for a long time. Now, what do you think is the impact of the MERS? And at the same time, there was a tremendous amount of kind of effort to revitalize the economy, and MERS was a big damper on that. How do you think was the impact of the government's effort to do that?
As Dr. Linton mentioned, I think a lot of the economic negative consequences resulting from the MERS outbreak was really totally unintended. In other words, and also unnecessary. It's a self-inflicted one, what I would say. Because as Dr. Linton pointed out, it's the contagious rate is much lower than typical flu, but the public education was lacking. People overreacted. So there's two ends of the spectrum. Inside the hospital, there was a complacency as to the danger, and even the leading hospitals like Samsung didn't follow the guidelines. Outside the hospital, people totally overreacted. I remember I was organizing a seminar involving speakers coming from the UK and the United States around in the middle of the MERS outbreak. And the organizers were all worried about having people together in an auditorium. I said, look, if you just follow the basic elementary school public hygiene, this is absolutely no danger to normal people. And the fact that you're worried about it potentially canceling the event, it just sends a wrong signal to the public and the world. It's totally unnecessary. And that was pervasive in the society, and that's why I call this economic damage was totally self-inflicted, unnecessary wound. So in terms of what the government had to do to prop up this self-inflicted damage, I mean, the government had to do something, but I mean, it was the worst aspect of it is it was totally unnecessary. So I think in terms of control tower and sort of post-outbreak remedies, instead of creating another bureaucracy, a control tower, super ministry, whatever it is, I think if there was such a task force to be created, what they should focus on is changing the culture. And I know changing the culture is not easy to do, certainly not achieved overnight, but I moved to Hong Kong in 2003 from Japan, where I lived for 6 years. And Japan, as you know, is a sort of a archetypical example of public hygiene that they live by the examples from when they're elementary school. And it was a very depressing sight during the SARS crisis, 2003, as soon as we arrived. Right. But now, even 12 years after the outbreak of SARS in Hong Kong, if you go to any public buildings, office buildings, apartment towers, retail shops, the elevator button panels get cleaned every 2 hours. That's just routine now. Okay. And if you go to any retail shops, any public places, there are hand sanitizing solution dispensers everywhere. That is a change of culture, and that's what's needed here, change of culture and relying on accurate information, not really phobia-induced information.
Okay. But I want to, before we move on to that, I want to focus on kind of one of the themes that kind of emerges, which is the not disinformation, but misinformation, certainly involved with the MERS crisis and also with the free trade agreements and TPP. What's your view on how the general public is being informed of these developments, and in terms of making a decision, in terms of the policy making and also the public opinions? It seems like there is a little bit of discrepancies.
I think everybody here agrees that Korean people, whether it comes to free trade agreement or a national crisis like MERS outbreak, tend to overreact. And my job as a cultural critic is to go into people's lives and say why they overreact. And I think the way Korean people conceive of government is sort of akin to 18th century French monarchic model of like providential state where government is supposed to be omnipotent and they're supposed to solve all the problem. And when you have this expectation, no amount of measure will satisfy the people. And because instead of saying, okay, these are tools that you can use, this is ABCD steps that you can use in your homes, at the hallway community in your apartment, at the level of the building, at the level of the village, unless those directives are given as sort of a community solution, everybody's sort of feeling helpless, waiting in front of their television, waiting other people to make decisions. And nobody likes the situation where they feel like 100% of the decision is being made by other people. That's going to make people panic. So I think in both cases, yes, information was lacking, but also the expectation was very, very, very high. And in terms of FTA, in any country when there is pursuit of free trade agreement, people do tend to overreact. And I think here also we need to sort of go into cultural level. Free trade of goods do not end at the level of the goods. Goods always bring with it symbolic value of the culture from which it comes. So when blue jeans came into Korea, blue jeans didn't want just a pair of pants. It symbolized the American way of life, for example. So when FTA is signed, people know instinctively that their way of life is going to change forever.
Right.
And how do you inform them how it's going to change and what they can do to sort of direct it themselves they will always feel helpless and they will always overreact.
Let me kind of stress one effort by the government, actually, President Park. This year kind of marked her a lot of making trips to other countries in an effort to do a multilateral diplomacy. And when she went to Middle East, as well as Central and South America, she brought the largest delegate of businessmen. Mr. Kim, do you think this had made some difference in the economic prospect?
Yeah, I mean, positively, it certainly sends a signal to the world and certainly to the target host countries for investment and trade that the government is behind the private sector's initiative in expanding trade and investment there. So it is a positive. On the other hand, we all know by the time presidential entourage and delegations happen, a lot of work in the private sector has already happened to make that trip possible. In other words, all these signings of MOU and contracts are not something that President has made possible, but it is a culmination of all the private sector efforts that lead up to that. And then it's kind of a showcasing in a collective manner the country is serious about doing business there. So it is, it's not unique to Korean administration, and every country does that. Chinese delegation does that when they go to UK and Europe, so forth. So it is. So you have to understand it in that context. It is a necessary political tool and show, but it is what leads up to that. All the private sector efforts that go into that. And also, after the trip, what's important is not to get sort of bogged down into certainly at the bureaucratic level. Just because the presidential trip happened in that country, they should make up projects or artificially promote projects that had to do with that country or region. That's the danger we should stay away from. We should really look at projects that are worth supporting, worth promoting, kind of on an objective evaluation basis, as opposed to, since we went there, we need to have 5 projects in this sector before next year. That is something we should guard against.
Right. Well, one of the big issue the remaining is the labor reforms and all those legislations that some have passed and some have not. And we've seen recently some big demonstrations on the streets as well. So this economic issues is clashing with the social issues.
Right.
Professor Park, do you think that there's enough will and drive on the part of the government and have a sagacity to kind of muddle through these conflicting views?
President Park Geun-hye again urged political circle to pass labor reform bills within this year. However, opposition parties are raising the issues. Out of 5 reform bills, the opposition parties are talking about the protection of part-time workers and the agent workers issue, something like that. As you know, since 1915th agreement, tripartite agreement, to pass the law, 5 reform bills, 2 issues were at the time very hot, being debated. One was whether to adopt wage peak systems or not. The other was how to dismiss, how to lay off the underperforming workers in the labor sectors. But these 2 very sensitive issues were omitted, to be inserted into the formal clause of the labor bills, but as a guidelines with non-binding measures, just suggestions. But I think opposition parties are criticizing too much, even to the labor unions and to part-time workers. There are a lot of content which is so much helpful and beneficial to those laborers and labor unions, I think. For example, we have the longest, almost among OECD members, 68 work hours weekly, per week. So it is going to be reduced to 52 hours, something like that. Also, talking about occupational insurance, compensations. Usually, when workers, when they go home or when they on their way home on their way back to work, something like, if they make incident out of their route to the work or going home, there was no insurance compensation systems. But this time, the law made it mandatory to make compensation for them. So
well, we can look at the individual legislations, but I will question whether these are specific kind of issue kind of situation, or what I would say there is a general discontent is a little bit deeper in the society, which could be historical, which could be something that has been brewing up because of the government's inability to push for the comprehensive packages. Maybe you can comment on whether there is a kind of deeper issues of disparities in the society and whether the efforts have been made by the society, or whether it be government or otherwise, to patch up that.
I think my job involves going into universities and speaking to a lot of young people. And I speak to a lot of young people, and I say, listen, do you think what the government is trying to do right now will help you get jobs when you come out of college? And they say no. Mm-hmm. And then I ask them, do you know what the government is trying to do? And then only thing they say is they're trying to make it easier to fire us. So beyond that, there is no real communication as to what the government is trying to do, or what exactly the package involves, or what efforts are being made, or what debates even exist. So I think, as in the previous cases, there is a huge communications failure. And second part is that I think a lot of young people are more dissatisfied anywhere. So I try to compare how Korean youth feels with, for example, my friends out in Europe or friends in the United States. And I ask them the same question. Is there labor reform going on in your country? How do you feel about it? And they all say that they're not trying to help us. And I was trying to figure out why this happens. And this is a hypothesis. I mean, I haven't tested it, but one of my hypotheses is, for example, if you compare the French labor system, which really promotes stability at the expense of job creation, and the American system, which promotes flexibility and job creation over stability, there are always going to be people who like more risk-taking, and there are always going to be people who like less risk-taking. So there are going to be American people that I speak to who's going to say, oh, there's too much, how they would say, capriciousness in my life. There's nothing certain, and this makes me nervous. And some people will love it, and they won't speak because they're too busy doing their jobs. And when I speak to French people, the people who fit that system, who like going through the Grand École system, going into a large corporation and staying there all their lives, won't complain about how they're unable to switch jobs at will or how there's not enough risk-taking in their society, but people who are left out of that system will speak. So I think the big question is, the first question obviously is what's good for Korean economy. But the question we're not asking enough is how much that policy fits general economic aspiration and cultural aspiration of Korean people looking for jobs. Because even the best policy, optimum policy economically, if it doesn't agree with, if general Korean youth's will and aspiration is not maximizing his economic return, but having something else in life, and if it doesn't address that, you will always have this screeches.
I think it's a very good point. Let's take a look at a video summarizing the issues that Upfront has covered in the past year. And after that, we'll move on to diplomacy, politics, and security in 2015. Today's Upfront, we discuss issues.
We have a distinguished guest in studio. First of all,
2015 was a year filled with huge events, both domestic and international. Upfront discussed a variety of issues, covering all fields of politics, diplomacy, and economy. In the field of economy, Upfront tackled key issues and debates, such as aggressive entry of global players into the Korean market, the emissions trading system, the launch of the AIIB, and the TPP agreement. Korea was the first country in Asia to implement a national emissions trading system. And we discussed its possible damage to industries, outlook, and policy challenges ahead. The issue of climate change was brought up once again in the episode on the UN Climate Change Conference, or Ep.91, which took place in Paris. Aside from heavy issues such as inter-Korean relations and politics, Upfront also covered issues of social interest, such as the retrieval of cultural assets to raise viewer interest in the program. For example, the episode with the highest VOD views this year was about preparations for the Pyeongchang 2018 Winter Olympics. As Korea prepares for the Pyeongchang 2018 Winter Olympics, we also discussed other initiatives to promote the Olympics, such as the 2016 to 2018 Visit Korea year. Upfront also visited an international forum that drew global attention. This was Jeju Forum, held in May, where we held interviews with its honored guests. Various global issues and renowned figures were introduced to viewers throughout the 3 special episodes. Another international event that drew attention was Expo Milano 2015, held in Italy. At this major event, participated by 145 countries around the world, traditional Korean cuisine came into the spotlight for its harmony of taste, beauty, and nutritional value. Korea also became the host country of a global event this year. It was the OECD Ministerial Meeting Daejeon 2015, World Science and Technology Forum, the first to be held in an Asian country. In its coverage of the event, Upfront emphasized the significance of cooperation in science and technology. This was Upfront's roundup of key economic and social issues in 2015. Now, let's move on to the major diplomatic issues of the year, from the controversial THAAD deployment to fluctuating dynamics in Northeast Asia.
Let's now talk about the diplomacy and politics and some of the security issues. Now, 2015 saw a lot of changes and fluctuating situations in Northeast Asia, including the North-South relations. I want to ask you, Dr. Linton, what do you think was the kind of biggest issues in the diplomacy and politics area that the government has focused on?
Between North and South, or?
Or in general, in terms of politics.
Well, I think President Park has taken a very aggressive, because Korea is an export economy, she has taken a very aggressive stance in visiting many countries and signing economic deals. I think that's very good for Korea, good for us. What's been a little bit discouraging is that North-South relations. There seems to be a worldwide clock, international clock, and a North and South Korea clock, and they don't seem to always agree. I'm a person that believes, I mean, I've been involved in a lot of NGO work in North Korea with tuberculosis, but I think it's business that will, Korea is an island right now, South Korea is, and I think we need to get past this. We need to have roads up to Russia, roads up to China, railroad to Russia, railroad to China. I think there's an enormous potential for economic growth if we can economically work with North Korea. They have 27 times the natural resources we have. We have 4,000 doctors a year coming out. We probably have that many lawyers coming out, or judges. And so in the future, many people are very negative about reunification, but we've got to at least start, even though we don't reunify, we've got to start working with North Korea. And I think the civilian sector, businessmen, not necessarily the government, is where the answer is.
I see. On that issue, in the first episode of Upfront, you came out, and the topic specifically was about the reunification bonanza that President Park talked about the previous year. Year after that, do you think that there has been significant progress from that point?
Unfortunately, no. And this has to do with, of course, politics and the nuclear issue. But if we could somehow put the nuclear issue and that type of politics aside and do more economic cooperation and bring the security climate down a little bit and not so heightened tenseness, I think Korea could economically benefit tremendously from a much more peaceful environment with North Korea. And slowly, I think we are always thinking politics first and the leaders. Well, I'm not so sure if that's the answer. Look at Kaesong. With all of the difficulties, Kaesong is continued to shine as a model project. We need 5, 10, 20 Kaesong projects. North Koreans need to have a lot to learn from South Korea. on how to build good products, make good products cheaply that are also worldwide competitive. And I'm not an expert in this, but I think there's a huge economic dividend if we could improve relations with North Korea.
The question is, I think the question is that still we don't have much trust upon each other. You witnessed even during the last 1 year, landmine explosion in the front line, demilitarized zone, something like that. South Korea was always attacked, and always, we were troubled by North Korean provocations. Even though we made a lot of agreement, dozens of agreements between the two Koreas, North Korea has not kept their word. So we do not have much trust on the North Korean dictatorship there. So I think, in the coming years, the third generation from Kim Il-sung to Kim Jong-il to Kim Jong-un, the leader Kim Jong-un must realize that if North Korea does not open their economy to the outside market, more and more people will be starving, and not starving, but will be suffering probably. So we need really, more sincere approaches, inter-Korean dialogues. First, to come to the dialogue table of six-party talks, they have to start really showing sincerities, not lying to the outside world that we are trying to eliminate nuclear devices and facilities. Then we can have some more and more trust, then we could help them. Otherwise, as we enter into the May 24 measures, something like that, right after Park Hwang-ja was assassinated by North Korean soldiers in Kumgang tourism project areas. So I think we need basic trust first.
Now let's move on to China issue, because this is all related. 2015, probably one can argue that this was a very good year for the relationship between Korea and China. Korea has joined AIIB, Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, and also the President Park was a notable dignitary in participating in the Victory March in China, commemorating the end of the World War. So those factors kind of conspire to say that Korea-China relationship is closer than ever in the history. Do you agree with that assessment, Dr. Linton?
President Park, I don't think we realize the impact she has had on the Chinese people, because she spoke in Chinese during her visits, not the entire time. But politicians do politics with state leaders, but they also do politics with the people. And she is tremendously popular in China and has a very special relationship with the Chinese premier. So I think it's very helpful to us, especially in dealing working out our problems with North Korea also. The fact that the personal relationship is there. The Chinese consular general told me after her first visit to China that never in his country had there been a higher level state visit. In other words, the red carpet being put out, that even a better welcoming than for an American or Western European leader. President Park was welcomed very warmly, not as just a friend, but as family. That's the type of wording he was using.
Right.
So I think there's a lack of understanding of what a good job, particularly, she has done with China. And I think the FTA, for example, recently was passed. I think we need to capitalize on this. China is a major player. We export more to China than any other country in the world. And I think this is very, very important, and also for our economic survival. So I'm very, very pleased, actually. And I think we shouldn't belittle or underestimate the government's accomplishments.
That good diplomatic accomplishments, one can argue from the Washington's point of view, they might see it as a little bit of a nervousness as the Korea gets closer to China.
Yeah, actually, I tend to disagree with that, because it is that what Dr. Linton just mentioned regarding the current administration's achievement of a good relationship with China. What's remarkable is that has been achieved in the context of keeping another excellent relationship with the United States. I was just at dinner recently where U.S. Ambassador Lippert talked about, emphatically conveyed President Obama's message that Korea-U.S. relationship has never been better. And that is not an exaggeration. And I think to achieve that on both Korea-U.S. side and Korea-China side is a remarkable achievement that I really give a lot of credit to the current administration.
We have two superpowers at this point. Now, it seems like to an extent there is some game where the good relationship on this side could bring some concerns from the other side. How do you get this situation under control?
President Park Geun-hye's emphasis on unification jackpot. Without the help of Chinese expanded roles into North Korean policies, it cannot be achieved. Probably Madam Park Geun-hye is analyzing future Korea-China relations in this prism, I think, and somewhat worried about our government too much tilting toward Peking's new strategy, something like that. But I think still South Korea's diplomatic basic stance is based on Korea-U.S. alliance in terms of security issues. But economically, as Dr. John mentioned, Chinese huge market. We export over 23% of our total export volumes to Chinese market, more than to the United States market, European Union market. It means that after ratifying Korea-China FTA, China is more and more integrated into also a military security dimension of the Korean future strategies. Right? This is very important, I think. So we have to make a very good balance between the security and the diplomatic stance toward the Washington and more economic stance toward Beijing, but also creating more a mixed stances in the future, utilizing these kind of changes.
I don't want to leave out the relationship between Korea's relationship between Japan, which is also very related. I would say that it has been strained. If you could comment on that.
Well, yeah, I mean, the fact that the topic of Korea-Japan relations almost came as a footnote to this whole discussion is a sign of how damaged and dysfunctional the relationship has become. Again, similar to what I said earlier about North-South dialogue, talking is always better than not talking, and you cannot expect the other side's behavior change as a condition for talking, because you got to take the ownership of the relationship to be in your interest. So the role of diplomacy is not to have neighbors become your lovable neighbors, but acceptable, coexistable neighbors. I think that's really the goal, not to be a lovable neighbor. So I think if you understand that, and then what's in your interest in having a healthy and viable and vibrant relationship between Korea and Japan, I think there should be a lot more happening than what is happening now.
Let's move on. So far, we've discussed the Korean issues in 2015. Next, let's move on to the major global issues of 2015.
Upfront covered a wide range of global issues this year. Let's take a look at 4 key issues that have garnered the most attention. First was the escalating threat of ISIS threatening the international community. There was shocking news regarding IS's recruitment of youth around the world, including Korea. Upfront's episode on ISIS discussed the current situation and collective global response to the universally condemned organization. We also discussed global medical emergencies with an episode on efforts to eradicate Ebola, a highly contagious disease. The Korean government sent 3 medical teams, and we discussed these efforts by Korea, as well as international measures to combat epidemics currently and in the future. In September, a picture of a dead Syrian child shocked the international community. Upfront covered the refugee issue, which became the focus of global attention. We discussed key issues such as the European refugee debate, the role of international organizations, and Korea's response to the refugee crisis. International cooperation is the most critical factor in promoting balanced growth in the global economy. The Sustainable Development Goals, or SDGs, were adopted at the UN General Assembly in September, to establish an improved framework for achieving this goal. Upfront discussed the significance of the SDGs and the role of Korea in implementing those goals. These were some key global issues that Upfront covered this year. Let's discuss them in greater detail, along with some other critical issues in the international community.
Let's move on to the global issues. Now, I guess the first topic that comes to my mind is a terrorist attack by ISIL. And what's fresh in our mind is also Paris terror attack on November 13th. It's a big threat to the global issue. I don't know if anybody has an answer to that, but if I can narrow it down, we had, in February, Korean youth has joined ISIL, and it seemed like the ISIL was attracting a lot of youth, not only from Korea, from around the world. So if you can comment on what kind of measures we might need to kind of stem that tide and counter that fresh recruitment.
I think this issue is quite relevant to the defect of human civilization we have in the 21st century. Because under the current world capitalist system, even though we terminated communism because it has not produced any meaningful political philosophies to make people happy, I think we have created two issues of social inequality within one society among people, but among different nations in world dimension. The other is environmental degradation. These two issues are very important issues to be dealt with by the United Nations or by all the superpowers in the future. So I think these kind of more worsening world environment caused by economic difficulties, also global warming issues creating more diseases, also added by religious prejudices against one another, something like that. So capitalism, based on capitalism, liberal democracies have not prevented this kind of youth tilting toward this kind of terrorist extreme means to express their opinion, something like that. So I think from a general perspective, power and wealth-oriented human civilization must be changed into a value-oriented world civilizations, remedying the defect of capitalism and create a more fair society so that regardless of their religions, cultural background and ethnicities, we should create a cultural world of fairness and more accommodated values that everybody could share in the future. So if we do not remedy this kind of defect and ills of current human civilizations, I think these kind of extreme activities, like an ISIL and Al-Qaeda, will continue to come out. This is the basic question, I think.
Basic and very big project.
Well, yeah. Question is, how do we do that? I mean, it's a tall order to change human civilization in such a grand scale. I mean, that's really the question. I think on the one hand, I'm quite pessimistic, and I recently heard President Obama talk about in kind of informal fashion that he's a natural-born optimist. But on the Middle East question, including the ISIS, he just didn't see a clear path toward a quick solution. For somebody who is alleged to be the most powerful person with tremendous amount of resources at his disposal to say that is a really sobering thought. But one shining light, in my view, is the fact that China, Russia, United States, and almost all the nations that really matter are at least superficially on the same page as to the stated goal of destroying ISIS. That's a start, because there aren't many issues where all those countries are on the same page. So that I'm hoping will be beginning of finding some solution, because ultimately it's in the interest of all the superpowers, whether in the left side, right side, middle side, which alliance, it is in all the superpowers' interest to quash this spreading. Yeah.
Right. In your talks with the young people, do you see some connections as to what kind of social kind of complaints that people might have or dissatisfaction would
I don't think
push them towards more?
I don't think it has directly to do with material dissatisfaction of the youth. Just because you don't have a job, you don't strap a bomb to yourself and blow yourself up.
Right.
But I think what is going on is that there is a vacuum in humanities education in lots of countries around the world. In up to mid-19th century, either community tradition or religion told people how to live and what are the relevant questions to ask. From mid-19th century to about end of 20th century until end of Cold War, it was ideology or some kind of philosophy. But the consumer society has imposed on people this responsibility of individualism. Individualism is beautiful if you look at it as freedom, but it's a very taxing thing if you have to decide your own value system at every moment that you have to make a decision. So in this vacuum of sort of a system of a humanitarian thinking, it's very easy for a group of extremists who provide very simple value system to follow and who have a very, very good handle on new media to go into minds of these youth and bring them out. So I think when you look at the ISIS problem, instead of looking at it as a political problem or religious problem or a regional problem, we have to understand that it's a global youth problem, and global youth problem caused by the fact that humanity education has not addressed the use of new media as well.
Certainly a sobering thought for educators especially. Now, Dr. Linton, there's another aspect to a global issue, not leaving the ISIL issue, but Ebola virus that has kind of crushed the African region in the early part of 2015. Korea sent a medical team, which was the first time to do that. Do you see that there's a global cooperation or collaboration governance regime?
One thing I learned from the Global Security Summit that we hosted was that actually the NGOs were more proactive than governments in the initial. And then actually the US and Korea are to be complimented because Korea sent a team. The US was very aggressive in Western Africa. But I think it was a terrible epidemic, but at the same time, a show of resolve that's never been experienced before. And we've crushed it. We've eliminated Ebola, for now anyway. I mean, there may be other outbreaks later, sporadic, but, and it came through global cooperation. So I think there's a very, very positive thing to learn. We were effective, and the gentleman who was head of the whole campaign was with me, and he said the most emotional thing for him was that he was able to shake his driver's hand after several months. They couldn't even shake hands.
I see.
And that it was, once it was over and all crushed, as he was leaving, he grabbed his driver's hand and said, "Thank you for all your help." And it brought both of them nearly to tears. But from a medical point of view, he was just being careful not to shake anybody's hand.
Right, right. Isn't that something that we can build on, that kind of model of governance? And you mentioned that, which kind of strikes me, is that not the government, but the NGO were very proactive in this. And that speaks to the stakeholder kind of approach that we need to espouse. I think I would ask for the wrapping up comments from you, and the general question is, now that we talked about these issues, I mean, how do we look forward to 2016, and what kind of mindset or any kind of suggestions? Mr. Cho.
I think many Korean people still see Korea as being sort of an isolated island in the world. And you know, when I go on other more popular sort of television shows and I speak about international issues, they frankly are not that interested. They say, no, we got our problems at home. And I think in 2016, we are really going to feel global issues shaking us, like trembling Korea. And I think on a positive note, it'll be a wake-up call that normal, average Korean people will no longer be able to ignore that our lives are inextricably linked with the people around the world. And if we open up to that and we seek proactive solutions on global level, like Dr. Park said, I think we have a good future. But I think if we entrench onto ourselves, then we'll have a very, very hard road ahead.
Mr. Kim, how do we look forward to 2016?
Yeah, I think we have to put things in perspective. I was recently talking to Thomas Byrne, who's the new president of Korea Society in New York, and he was kind of shaking his head. And I don't understand why Korean people are so worried about the so-called youth employment issue in Korea. And he said, do you know what the youth employment rate in Spain is? It's 50%. I said, I understand that, but because the threshold level for anxiety among Koreans is very low. And I told them partly because of that, Korea is successful at that as it is, because we're never satisfied, always worried, even when we're succeeding. And that is a sign of a superachiever. And you know the book Andy Grove wrote, Only the Paranoid Succeed.
Right.
And we are an archetypal example of that. So what I want to say is to put things in perspective. We may be too focused on what's happening within this peninsula, but look around, we are doing well. We're doing okay. There are no countries without issues. And also, at the same time, to prevent things like MERS outbreak-related damages to the economy and so forth, people need to be educated. They need to consume correct information, be educated, and not to over-worry, but also follow sensible rules and common sense. That's what I want to urge Koreans.
Great. Dr. Linton, you have a unique capability to offer suggestions from an insider's point of view and also outsider's point of view. You're wrapping words.
Korea is a great country. 70 years since the creation of the modern state of Korea. I think we Koreans don't realize what a good country they have. The security within Korea. We have the best probably police force in the OECD. The crime rate is the lowest. We have a super transportation system here, KTX, and there's so many. We have, we have so much to be appreciative of, but we're, as you said, we're always unsatisfied. I think it's time for Koreans to. They've carried a heavy load for a long time. It's time to rest a little bit and look back at the last 70 years and a time of readjusting goals and direction on where we're going, and be very proud and be a little bit more satisfied than in the past about where we are today and where we're going. It's truly a remarkable country. I feel very blessed to live here. And I think Korea is going to have a very good future. It's, of course, the politics are very noisy, but it's very healthy politics. There are many, many good things about Korea that we take for granted.
On that note, I would have to conclude this discussion. I mean, as short as the time it is, I think we are in agreement that as complex as the world is and as many issues there are, we should kind of take ourselves into that foray and think about global issues and think about the role that the individual and as Korea should play. Thank you for your insights today.
Thank you.
Thank you for having us. Yeah.
We looked at the global issues today, and next year we'll come up with, we'll bring many more worthy issues. Thank you for watching, and have a great year-end holidays and Happy New Year.